Wow, isn't this a beautiful place? I got up this morning, took a little walk around the property. I am always just in awe of how beautiful and serene it is up here. A perfect place for just this sort of gathering. We can just get together and relax and enjoy each other. You know, get a little information, get a little empowered, help empower others. A really good deal. So I'm going to start here by giving you a message from my wife, who's over in China. She said to say ni hao. That's hello in Chinese. That's about the extent of my Mandarin at the moment. I am trying to learn Mandarin, complicated language, but it's a lot of fun. When I take the lesson, after the lesson, I can come out and tell you something, and then I immediately forget it. But you know, I think it's important to challenge yourself, right? Just because I'm getting old, not old, just getting old, doesn't mean that I should stop challenging myself. I'd like to challenge my mind all the time, right? Because there may be a time when the body's not cooperating, but as long as the mind is cooperating, I'm good, right? So I try to take on things like mind games, play mind games, keep the exercise up, try to stay sharp. You know, I was always pretty good with numbers, so I try to stay good with numbers. When I do Sudoku, I run a timer and have a goal that I'm trying to hit. Things like that, just to, because I want to be able to measure myself. And the reality is that on the average Sudoku, you make I like to do the easy ones because I like to go fast sometimes. On the average of those, 10 years ago, my average was about 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Do the easy ones. Right now, my average is about 3 minutes and 42 seconds. And I'm really upset about that 30-second change. Anyway, enough about me. Let's talk about this. Life at the leading edge. No, it's one thing to be at the leading edge. It's a whole other thing to stay at the leading edge. Okay? Think about that for a moment. If you think about it in an athletic endeavor, you know, a Super Bowl might be being at the leading edge, or even going to the Super Bowl might be considered being at the leading edge of football. But how many get there and stay there and win the next year's case? 3 years? I don't know if anybody's run a 3-peat, maybe I'm not that in depth. But beyond that, you know, they fall off the leading edge. And one of the things that you'll find about Neolife is we have been at the leading edge and managed to stay there for decades. When I say managed to, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of effort. But most importantly, it's a lot of commitment. Because it takes a commitment from the company's leadership to empower a group like the SAB to go and pursue at the leading edge. And it's yet another thing to empower the group, the SAB and all of the people in the Product Science and Technology group, to keep us at the leading edge. It's really an important thing to consider. So as I go through here, I'm going to tell you about that story. I'm going to show you some examples of leading edge things that we have done and talk to them in a sort of product sense. You know, we can talk to them in a lot of ways, but I'll talk in sort of a product sense, the way we do things, keep us at the leading edge, and talk about what that means. So let's take a look. First of all, 65 years. You know that less than 1% of companies that start get anywhere near 65 years. A very, very small number. In our industry, it's even a smaller number. There's companies 65 years out there. You know, like General Electric, been around a long time. Polaroid, they didn't make it. But the point of the matter is that to have this happen, to have Neolife sustain itself, be that durable for 65 years, is an amazing achievement in a business sense, as well as in all the other ways that we do things. So I need to think about that. I need you to think about that for a moment. The reason that we are capable of doing this is because it goes right back to the founding philosophies of the company. It's the principles and philosophies that you employ over and over and over and over again that allow you to achieve that. I'm getting a little feedback here all of a sudden. Anyway, so let's take a look. History. We have a very unique history. It spans 65 years. We were one of the first nutritional supplement companies in the world. Not that there weren't a few others, there were a few others, but we were the first that actually focused on the idea of going to the food supply and looking at things that might be missing as a result of the industrialization of the food supply and applying it back to human health. That would be creative. And all of those, when we all came off the farm, we all were used to eating fresh whole grains and stuff like that because, well, we came off the farm. But when we came back from World War II, people who had been on the farm said, I want to live in the suburbs because I have a job now. And when they did that, they had to industrialize the food supply. So one of the things you find about the whole grain bread that my grandmother used to make is it had a short shelf life. And they said, well, we need to come up with bread that we can make today, ship it to a warehouse. 3 days from now, we'll ship it to a supermarket. 3 days after that, someone will buy it. And 3 weeks later, it'll still be bread. Called Wonder Bread. They called it Wonder for a reason. It wasn't that it was a wonder so much as they wondered if it was bread. Anyway, we were really in on the ground floor of this whole idea, at the genesis point of this idea of, wait a minute, what are we doing to our diet, to our food supply? Industrialization of the food supply is one of the biggest drivers of chronic disease in the world. One of the biggest drivers of chronic disease in the world. We know that because one of the chronic diseases is obesity. And it's because we eat too much of the wrong food. High caloric intake, low nutritional value. One of them is diabetes. High caloric intake in the form of sugar, low nutritional value. These sorts of things are what's driving the chronic disease epidemic that we've seen around the world. Alterations to the food supply, whether you make them intentionally by saying Monday night is pizza, Tuesday night is taco, Wednesday night is fried chicken, Thursday night is burgers, and Friday night we're going to celebrate and have some more pizza. That sort of a diet is a diet that a lot of people, too many people, fall prey to. Maybe not quite that bad, but there are people that eat that way, and as a result they end up in trouble. So as an industry pioneer, we started working on that. When we, as a pioneer, we championed the industry. We just didn't sit back and say we're going to be cool. We actually championed the industry. We got in the industry and worked to protect the industry. We engaged in the great FDA battles at the late 1960s when they decided that all dietary supplements should be by prescription only. Okay? That was an act that was pending in Congress that was proposed by a bunch of crazy people who were closely associated with the pharmaceutical industry. That summary, if you look back at how and why that happened, luckily we got together and with some like minds and some other people in the government who said, no, that didn't make any sense to us either. We were able to defeat the FDA in that challenge. And we have continued to do battle with them over the years. Later on in the 1970s, we engaged with them over food and food claims and what's a food and what's not a food and how you have to label it and so on and so forth. And we were fundamental, walking the halls of Congress and creating what's called the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, which is the basis of all how food is labeled to this day. And Nito Life was there, shaking hands with representatives and senators and their staff, saying, think this through, folks. Think this through. It's food, it's not drugs. It doesn't need to be supervised that closely, but it does need honest labeling. And so we got to that ground, and they did that. Later on in the 1990s, we were back in the halls of Congress, talking to the senators and to the representatives and their staffs in the formation of the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, DSHEA, that is the foundation of the industry today. The industry was in jeopardy in the 1990s because there was no regulation. The Food and Drug Act, which had been written in 1937, is where they tried to control food and dietary supplements. And by definition, they said, well, dietary supplements, they're not food, so they must be drugs. It doesn't make any sense, does it? It makes no sense, but it's a government thing. I have a lot of respect for government, but I have some issues with what they try to do too. So, but that sort of difference, you know, the people that are, the companies that you run into out there today, the ones that advertise on Fox News or whatever out there, they didn't participate in any of this. They weren't there developing the basis for which an industry could grow and become as big as it is. They're just living off the work that Neolife and others did back over the decades. Big difference in history. I talked about this a little bit yesterday. I just want to refresh your memory. But the Scientific Advisory Board is a great thing. We were the first one with the Scientific Advisory Board in our industry. The first one with the Scientific Advisory Board. And I'm not going to tell you that story again, but these are some pretty smart people. This is what I call actual intelligence, as opposed to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a very strong tool. It's just a tool, but a very strong and powerful tool. You know, we play with the tool and have it help us sort of question and answer things that we want. But in the end, it's going to be about the actual intelligence. And groups like this is what feeds that for us. Along the way here with the Scientific Advisory Board, I told you about we've collected all of these wonderful research partners. Again, you can't buy your way into this group. You only have to earn your way in. They have to respect you first and trust you first. And they don't care how deep your pockets are or anything else. They just want to know that they're going to associate their names and reputations with who? Who? And who can they trust? Big step. That resulted in world-class publications. These are some of the most prestigious peer-reviewed publications. Again, you can't buy publications. You have to earn publications. And the way the peer review process works is you do some research, you organize it into a report, you submit it to them, and they give it to a group of 5 or maybe more peer reviewers whose job is to find a problem with your research that keeps it from being published. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do. Okay? But that idea that peer review, that research organization publications like this, the New York Academy of Sciences, or the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, or Journal of International Toxicology, whatever it might be, those things, every time our work met that criteria, or exceeded it, then resulted in getting it published. So it's not a question or theory that our products do these things, it's a fact. We also have a world-class reputation. And in industry, you know, we were one of the founding members of the Council for Responsible Nutrition, and the first company, an Atlanta company, invited to join their senior scientific advisory council. I know that to be true because I was in the meeting and I was the guy they invited. Not that others didn't come along later on, but again, that tells you they're forming this scientific advisory council and they're looking to Neolife type folks, Neolife type messaging, and saying, help us do this. Participate in the creation of this thing that is still alive and viable today and has become very powerful. But help us set the groundwork, help us make the decisions, help us guide this process forward. And we were there. And still are. Over here in academia, you know, we do a lot of research with sort of academia, colleges and universities and things like that, non-corporate research organizations. And, you know, we've talked about them before, the FedReg, Plant Polyphenol Human Research Interest Group, which we actually started back in the late 1990s, when Dr. Kirby and I invited about a half a dozen of these people to have breakfast with us at a meeting of the Federation of Societies of Experimental Biology. We had done a lot of work on flavonoids, which are polyphenols, and others, so we said, we'd like to talk to you about this, and we got to having a conversation, and you know what, everybody got so excited with the conversation that we said, let's form a group. And we did, and it was called FedReg, Plant Polyphenol Human Research Interest Group. And we were the founding sponsor, and we remain the primary sponsor today. There are lots of other sponsors, USDA and, the Nut Council. I'm not sure what those people are doing. But a bunch of others, right? And you all know about the Arthur First lecture series, the relationship with the metal at the University of San Francisco, and we interact with Oregon State University Linus Pauling Institute all the time. So these are things that we continue to do. They like us, we like them, they trust us, we trust them, sort of situation. Very different. But we're also known for our innovation. I want to take just a moment. I could do many more of these, but I've got a reasonably short period of time to deal with, and I just sort of focus on a few. We just talked about Trion, and Trion being innovative because it's really the first product of its kind that looked at getting these things that the food supply was eliminating, these lipids and sterols from whole grains, and giving them back to people and showing how that impacted it. But looking at other things, the artificial stomach, I always like talking about the artificial stomach. Okay. It's a situation that we first used as a sort of a research tool, meaning that we wanted to see how things go on in the stomach. It's really hard, especially back then, this was back in the late 70s. It's very hard to figure out what's going on inside somebody's stomach. These days, we'll just send a little camera down there that you can swallow. But back then, we did this like a deep, dark mystery, the bottom of the ocean sort of thing. So what we did is we said, well, if we want to make sure our products are going to work, there's a concept called clinkers. Anybody who remembers Don Lawson will remember the concept of clinkers, right? Yeah. Clinkers are when you take your supplement this morning and later on, or tomorrow morning, when you're on the toilet, you hear a clink. A lot of products didn't break down. If you get the compression too high on these things, you can make stones. So as we developed these products, we had to know they were going to break down, right? We wanted to know the parameters, how quickly, So we developed this artificial stomach, and from that, it ended up becoming a USP, a U.S. pharmaceutical protocol that we were doing before there was a U.S. pharmaceutical protocol. And in that protocol, it determines if you're going to put together a tablet or a capsule, you need to put it into this artificial stomach, which is made of artificial gastrointestinal juice, and a little machine that goes up and down to mimic peristalsis, the movement of the gastrointestinal tract. And then you look at and watch and measure. So if you put this tablet in, or capsule, or you put this thing in, you start the process. After a few minutes, you take some notes, take a little sample. Next few minutes, take some notes, take a little sample. Samples all go off for analysis. If you're looking for B vitamins, for example, you would take that over a period of 30 minutes or an hour, take all those samples and you would analyze them, and you would get a peak of bioavailability, right? Because where they got to the highest levels in those analyses would tell you your target. To make a long story short, every product we make today, then this became a quality control tool, every product we make today has a defined disintegration, dissolution, dispersion protocol, parameters. So when we make it in the lab, we put it in this machine, and it has to be, tablets have to take no longer than 30 minutes. Some of them we like to make sure they don't disintegrate too quickly, because 2 minutes after you consume it might not be the most optimal point. Some of them we use to determine that we survive the stomach and end up in the intestines, like acidophilus, because the stomach acid would kill the acidophilus. So we use this tool to do that. A really big innovation, and something that we were a principle in developing, I think, in the industry. Talk about Betagard for a moment. How many people know today about detoxifying? Antioxidants and detoxifiers. Okay, we introduced this product in the 1970s. Now, you know about it today because, 50 years later, a few people decided that it was probably a good thing, that there was lots of evidence. But this came from Dr. Kurtz, who had spent his life looking at what things cause cancer, and said, well, if I put in things here that I know block those things, then we could neutralize and detoxify them. But for example, he studied cadmium, and he found that in the presence of cadmium, in the presence of calcium, is neutralized. And that's just one of many examples. But Anyway, really important stuff. If you go up to the top where it says whole food bioactives, when I mentioned last night, when we were first extracting these things, we didn't really know where they were. We knew they were in there, but we didn't have identities. In the laboratory, if you're going to identify something, let's take a carotenoid, which 15 peaks or something like that in our product, you have to know what each one of those peaks represents. So how do you do that? How do you determine what that peak is? Well, you find a way to isolate things, different carotenoids, into these where you know they're pure isolates, and then you run the scan on them, and their peak shows up right here. And as you run them individually, you overlay that over the whole thing, and it tells you everything that's in the product. And you can identify the beta-cryptozanthate from the antozanthate, or from the whatever else might be going on, zeaxanthin, one of the xanthates, right? Very complicated. We pioneered that whole thing, not just the product that came out of it, but the investigational tools that are used to get that done. Take a look at Salmon Oil Plus. You know, to us, Salmon Oil Plus was easy. We've been selling salmon oil for a long time when we introduced this, and it was pretty obvious to us that nature had a plan for salmon oil, and it wasn't just EPA and DHA like the rest of the industry was trying to tell you. Because when we looked at it, again, by identifying the peaks in our laboratory, we could see that there were 8 omega-3 fatty acids in nature's plan in nutrition. So it seems pretty obvious to us what we should do. And then when you get over to glycemic response control, one last thing. You know, we started researching this idea in the 1990s and brought it to market as glycemic response control technology in, I think, 2000. Got published in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition about that time as well. For a long time, the only place you heard glycemic response control was in Neolife, until about 2015, where other dietary companies that are out there started telling you about glycemic load, and glycemic response, and glycemic index, and stuff like that. The reason that we were so far ahead of them is because guess what? We were so far ahead of them. We were looking at what goes on in the body and saying, of course, that's something you need to be able to manage. Of course, that's a technology you need to be able to apply. So now I'm going to run through a couple of big things here. One of the big Neolife differences that keeps us at the leading edge is our ingredient sourcing. We have a nature-first approach. Whenever we go to look for something, we go to look for nature. You know, we were provided with all of these things in this wonderful world in which we exist. And it was put before us for us to choose from. And what we do is we tend to wander from the path. It's obviously not the only place we wander from the path, but humans tend to wander, I guess. But we wander from the path, and as a result of that, we compromise the basic foundation of how our bodies work. So we always go to nature and ask the question, based in nature, backed by science, actually means something. But it's not just a slogan, it's a way we behave for decades. So ingredient sources is important. And then controlling your ingredients. It's one thing to say we're going to use spinach as an ingredient. It's another thing to be able to control your spinach, because you can get spinach all over the place. And it will have varying degrees of quality and maybe varying risks for contamination. Every now and then you hear about spinach or some other green leafy vegetable being recalled because it's got salmonella or something in it. These are issues that we deal with. So when we control our ingredient sourcing, we choose a source and then we control that, those are all things we take into consideration. From where it's grown, how it's processed, how it's handled, meeting individual criteria along the way for quality control, whether or not it's GMO. That's not an easy deal. The reason it works so well for us is we started it decades ago worrying about GMO. But nowadays it gets more and more complicated because genetic modification gets more and more sophisticated. Right? They make little tweaks in one little gene sequence, and all of a sudden that soybean tastes like beef, or whatever. And we track that all the way from where we start We pick up our raw materials all the way through to the end. So when it's on your table, you've got a batch number on the side of the bottle, and the little batch number opens up a file that goes back all the way down the supply chain. Now that you've got these ingredients controlled, how do you manufacture them? Remember, I just said, if you get the compression too high on the tablet, it's not going to work. It's going to go clink. But that's just one very, very simple thing. You realize in the act of compressing the tablet, you generate heat, and heat can degrade some of the materials that are in it. So it's not just making sure the compression's right, it's being able to do compression and then have the technology to measure the heat being generated by the compression to determine whether or not it's going to adversely impact your raw material, your ingredient. You know, if I press vitamin C hard enough, there won't be any vitamin C in it, even though it started with it, because the heat will cause it to oxidatively modify and go away. It'll be there, at least some oxidized version, as far as that. So there's a tremendous amount of technology. It's not just where you source your raw material, it's very, very, very important. But it's how you handle it, how you treat it. Big deal, that difference. And then it's how you control all that. Right? How do you control that? When somebody's sending you something into your supply chain, let's say carrots, just for fun, how do you know where they came from? How do you know how to handle it? Well, the way we do is that we have requirements. If you're sending us bulk carrots, we have a certificate of analysis that they need to comply with carrots. It's not like you're going to the local grocery store and saying, "Can I have a certificate of analysis on those carrots right there?" No, they haven't a clue. But we have to have a clue. And we have to have data and evidence. So we get a thing that says these carrots have to come, first of all, they have to start with this particular natural genetic signature, and then we have to process them through. So they come in from the fields, and then they're checked, and then they're processed to a way to, get them ready for manufacture, and then they're checked, and then we go through the process of getting the oil out of the carrots. The oil is where all the carotenoids are, so we get rid of the fiber and sugar and water, and then we check again. And then we put this thing together in a mix with other types, what we call oleoresins, resins, by the way. We put them together like that, and we check again. And then we put it in the capsule, and we check again. And then we put it on the shelf, and years later we'll check again. Okay. That sort of quality control is fundamental. It tells you a lot about how the company operates. Because of this, this is something I always like to say, we have our product quality control, products quality control, when it comes for potency and consistency and purity, meet or exceed the regulatory requirements of every major regulatory authority in the world. Every major regulatory authority in the world. We don't go everywhere yet. But everywhere we go, we don't really have any trouble meeting those criteria. And we've been there for years. The Japanese are an example. Those are tough folks. We've been sending stuff to Japan for decades. And even though we've known them and gone to lunch and shared the occasional sake, they're still very demanding, right? Still very demanding. So just think about that. That our quality control criteria for purity, potency, and consistency meets or exceeds the regulatory requirements of every major regulatory authority on the planet. And what that means, all of that adds up to superior products. Superior products that deliver life-changing benefits. You all know about the life-changing benefits out there. We know because we hear from you. But every one of the products you see in that picture there is unique as to how we make it. It's unique as to how we source raw materials, the way we handle the manufacturing, the testing that goes on during the manufacturing process, and everything that goes into that makes it a superior product. And that is Neolife at the beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. John Miller. Can you see why I